Integration of Indigenous presence into higher education. Before beginning the video, please take a brief moment to pause and read through the following analysis questions. Meet Miss Healthy. Miss Healthy is a professor at Centennial College's Nutrition and Food Service Management program, also known as NFSM. Centennial Colleges offer Indigenous training to faculty over the 2019 Reading Week. The two-day course seeks to support Indigenous training and education in Ontario. Centennial College wants Miss Healthy to identify courses in the program into which she can incorporate Indigenous assignments and training. Implementation for this integration is mandated for fall 2019. Miss Healthy's goal is to successfully incorporate Indigenous training into her courses by fall 2019. Centennial will offer this training to improve Indigenous student engagement and well-being, and to shrink the achievement gap between Aboriginal students and the college. Miss Healthy will need to receive proper Indigenous training specifically on residential schools, the 60s Scoop, trauma theory, the Indian Act, and government services that will address the current socio-economic conditions in Indigenous communities. Miss Healthy will utilize a number of resources to create learning objectives, such as government links, articles, and documents regarding Indigenous people. Ms. Healthy will identify which courses within Centennial's NFSM program are best suited to incorporate Indigenous training. Ms. Healthy will develop learning outcomes, learning objectives, and assignment templates to implement Indigenous training. Learning theories, emphasis on the social and cultural context. Constructivist strategies use the shift toward real-life application, where the learner is given the opportunity to construct personal meanings from what is presented. This is from Ali 2007. Constructivism also supports John Piaget's 2 principles for learning. Within the framework of cognitive constructivism, John Piaget defined 2 principles for learning. Learning is presented actively, and learning must be authentic and connected to real life. This is from Piaget, 1977. The Indian Act is as follows. It is an evolving, paradoxical document that has enabled trauma, human rights violations, and social and cultural disruption for generations of First Nations people. This is a direct quote from Henderson, 2006. Lack of equity in the Act regarding Indian status. Indigenous people who lost their status as a result of marriage were reinstated under the revised Act, Bill C-31. The 60s Scoop is as follows. The widespread forced removal of Indigenous children from their communities and adoption into non-Indigenous communities, leading to the loss of their cultural identity. And this is from Sinclair and Daynard, 2016. Residential schools is as follows. Government-sponsored religious schools established to assimilate Aboriginal children into Euro-Canadian culture. This is a direct quote from the Canadian Encyclopedia. The impact of forced removal into these schools led to the development of social disorders such as alcoholism, abuse, and suicide in Indigenous peoples passed down through generations. This is from Castellano et al., 2008. The trauma theory is as follows. High rates of Aboriginal victimization as a result of colonization have led to Indigenous people losing control over their families and culture. This is from Ursel, 2001. Unequal access to healthcare and clean drinking water on the reserves contributes to current inequity and health conditions of Indigenous Canadians. This is from Waldrum et al. 2006. Increased occurrence of chronic illnesses amongst Aboriginal communities related to both diet and lifestyle. This is from McConnell, 2013. Indigenous treaties and land claims have been put in place. However, these treaties have not always helped the socio-economic status of these Aboriginal communities. North America's Indigenous population has been at a disadvantage since the earliest days of colonization, with both England and France forging and breaking alliances with various groups and tribes in an attempt to establish control over this new, to them, continent. French authorities encouraged a peaceful coexistence with the Indian populations, including a 1627 ordinance offering converted Indians the status of natural Frenchmen. To quote American history Francis Parkman, Spanish civilization crushed the Indian. English civilization scorned and neglected him. French civilization embraced and cherished him. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was an attempt by the Crown to assure the Indian population that their interests would be protected if they were to side with the British by discouraging British subjects from settling on Indian lands specified in the proclamation, but it was openly disregarded by many settlers with little to no consequences imposed by the authorities of the time, as was the earlier Easton Treaty of 1758. Most treaties were broken, and Europeans kept settling lands that had been reserved for Indians. Smaller sections of these areas were formalized into reserves, pieces of which were frequently cut off and given to white settlers. Without enough land to feed themselves and their families, and unable to work due to racist hiring practices, many indigenous people found themselves in a multi-generational cycle of poverty and addiction. From the 1830s onward, many indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in residential schools where their culture and history were erased in an attempt to civilize them. Many children were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuses. Trauma can be passed down through the generations, and without the experience of being raised in a family, many victims were unprepared to raise families of their own, an effect that can carry through several generations. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed to document the experiences and abuses of the residential school system. In 2015, the findings and resources of the TRC were transferred to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Both federal and provincial governments have called for increased Indigenous content to be taught in schools, which is why most schools, including Centennial, have incorporated Indigenous training into their professional development programs. Solutions. The Federal Department of Indigenous Services Canada, also known as ISC, is responsible for improving access to high-quality services for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada, and to support the Indigenous peoples, deliver services, and address the socio-economic conditions in these communities. Sawchuk, 2018. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, launched in 2008, seeks to compensate residential school survivors for the trauma they experienced and build a more equitable future for Indigenous people. This is from Moran, 2015. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action. In order to reduce the impact of residential schools and mend the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee put forward 94 action items for the government to address, including children welfare, health, and justice. This is from Truth and Reconciliation Committee 2015. Federal law, such as the Canadian Constitution and the Human Rights Act in 2008, protects the rights of Indigenous people. The Royal Proclamation in 1963 gave Indigenous people their rights. Jordan's principle is as follows. Named after Jordan River Anderson, this principle ensures that Indigenous children are able to access a wide range of health, social, and educational services. This is from the Government of Canada, 2019. The following are Miss Healthy's solutions. Encourage enrollment in the Indigenous Studies First Peoples in Canada certificate program. Individual lesson plans for program classes. Incorporate learning methods such as storytelling, visual design, and movement. This is referenced from McConnell 2013. Consult with Chief Indigenous Advisor for all course curriculum development. Make it a program initiative requirement for students to take Indigenous training. Technology such as screencasting, interactive online modules can be used for additional training for faculty and students. And lastly, take advantage of Centennial incentives to enroll in online and in-person Indigenous training. Please take a moment to look through the following synthesis items. Thank you for watching.